We're good to go when you're ready.
Hello and welcome. I'm Adele Tutter, the Director of the Psychoanalytic Studies Program, or the PSP, which is housed by the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia University. The PSP is a certificate-granting course of study that encourages the exploration of the rich interface between psychoanalytic thought, the fine arts, the humanities and social sciences, and today, medical genetics. Our program today, Carrying Fragile X, Family, Heredity, Disability, is co-sponsored by the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics at the Columbia University Vagelos School of Medicine. I thank our three distinguished speakers who are joining us from New York, Los Angeles, and Switzerland for participating in this panel. Rather than interrupt the program, I will introduce all of them now. We will have time for a general discussion after the presentations. If you would like to ask a question, please submit it in the chat function and indicate whether you would like me to ask your question in person, in which case we will unmute you when we invite you to speak and ask your question. Our presenter today is Dr. Anne Skomorowsky. She's clinical instructor in psychiatry at the NYU Grossman School of Medicine. During her years as a psychiatrist, she has worked primarily in psychiatric emergency rooms and general hospitals, in which she became interested in the surprising ways that medical maladies and psychiatric disturbances interact. She started writing for the general public after participating in a fellowship sponsored by the Op-Ed Project, which helped her develop her interest in Fragile X and intellectual disability as a writer and not just a physician. Her writing on psychiatry and medicine has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Scientific American, and Slate. As a former scientist myself, I can vouch for Dr. Skomorowsky's ability to put complicated scientific concepts into very, very explainable language, doing a great service to the general public. Today, she will be sharing material from her new book, The Carriers: What the Fragile X Gene Reveals About Family, Heredity, and Scientific Discovery. Fragile X syndrome is the most common inherited cause of intellectual disability and autism. The Carriers is groundbreaking because it brings to public awareness the fact that carriers of Fragile X are often not as unaffected as they have long been presumed to be, but are in fact vulnerable to a whole host of disabling conditions that further impacts the lives of Fragile X families. Our first discussant will be Alex Minna-Stern, the Humanities Dean at UCLA, where she is professor in the departments of English and History and the Institute for Society and Genetics. Her research focuses on the history of eugenics, genetics, society, and justice in the United States and Latin America, and explores the dynamics of gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, disability, social difference, and reproductive politics. Professor Stern founded and co-directs the Sterilization and Social Justice Lab, an interdisciplinary, multi-institutional research team that works to reconstruct and analyze the history of eugenics and sterilization in five of the United States. Her many books include Telling Genes, The Story of Genetic Counseling in America, and Eugenic Nation, Faults and Frontiers of Better Breeding in Modern America, which won the Vizeltier Prize, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, from the American Public Health Association. Our second discussant will be Daniel Schechter, Associate Professor of Psychiatry in Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at the University of Lausanne, and attending child and adolescent psychiatrist at the Lausanne University Medical Center, where he is medical director of Papillon, an ambulatory program for children ages 0 to 5 and their parents, and co-director of the Perinatal and Early Childhood Training and Research Group. Dr. Schechter is trained as a psychoanalyst, and his award-winning research concentrates on the intergenerational transmission of trauma by examining the psychobiological impact of maternal history of exposure to interpersonal violence on the caregiving environment during early childhood development and on the social emotional development of very young children. Dr. Schechter is a co-editor of September 11, Trauma and Human Bonds. So let's start our program with Dr. Skomorowsky. I unmute you. You have to unmute yourself, Anne.
That okay?
Yes.
Everyone can hear? All right. I'm going to give a reading from my book, the cover of which you see here. It's called The Carriers. And before I start reading, I think that I need to define some terms and do a little bit of science. The first term that I need to define is carrier. There's a sort of basic tenet in genetics, which is that carriers of diseases pass diseases to their children, but don't have them themselves. So a classic example of a condition that is genetic where carriers have no symptoms is cystic fibrosis. In cystic fibrosis, a couple can give birth to a child who has the devastating disease, cystic fibrosis, but the parents are not aware that they are carriers of this condition. They don't have it themselves, and they have absolutely no symptoms that are related to having cystic fibrosis. So it will often turn out to be a huge shock when a couple give birth to a child with cystic fibrosis. In Fragile X syndrome, which I'll give some basics about in a second, things are a little bit different. In the past 20 years, it's been increasingly appreciated that carriers of Fragile X syndrome who don't have Fragile X syndrome themselves are vulnerable to a number of conditions that are related but different from Fragile X syndrome. And my book, The Carriers, explores these conditions and how they affect people who are now finding themselves in the position of raising children with Fragile X syndrome. Could I have the next slide? So what is Fragile X syndrome? Just very briefly, it's an inherited form of intellectual disability with significant behavioral disturbance. So there's intellectual disability, which can be quite severe, hyperactivity, self-injurious behavior like hand biting. Most kids with Fragile X syndrome have autism. In fact, Fragile X is the most commonly known single gene cause of autism. Most kids have a great deal of difficulty expressing themselves through language and are very anxious and demonstrate tactile defensiveness. What that means is they dislike being touched and approached and will defend themselves sometimes violently against people, even people they love, who approach them unexpectedly. They also frequently have sleep disturbance. And the bottom line, I think, that I'm trying to make here is that kids with Fragile X syndrome are very hard to raise. They have a lot of behavioral issues and cause a great deal of stress within their families. Could I have the next slide? So basics of Fragile X. Fragile X is a genetic disease. The gene that's involved in Fragile X syndrome is called FMR1. That gene codes for a protein, which is known as FMRP. FMRP has a lot of jobs that it does within the developing brain, basically the fetal brain. And you need FMRP to prevent Fragile X syndrome. If you have no FMRP, you will have Fragile X syndrome. If you have some FMRP, you won't have it. Why could this happen? The FMR1 gene has, like all genes, a string of repeated DNA bases, which are called CGG repeats. The difference between a healthy person, a carrier, and a person with Fragile X syndrome is all in the number of CGG repeats that are in the gene. If you have too many CGG repeats, the gene gets turned off, it can't make FMRP, and without FMRP, the person has Fragile X syndrome. Next slide, please. A little more about CGG repeats. Everyone has an FMR1 gene, and everyone has CGG repeats in their FMR1 gene. Normal, healthy individuals generally have between 5 and about 55 CGG repeats. People with over 200 CGG repeats have full mutation Fragile X syndrome because they're unable to make FMRP. Then there are people in the middle, between 55 and 200 CGG repeats. those people are carriers of Fragile X syndrome. They have what's called the Fragile X premutation. The prefix pre refers to the fact that you need to go through the premutation to get to the full mutation. People who have 35, 50 CGG repeats cannot give birth to a child with Fragile X syndrome. If you have between 55 and 200 CGG repeats, you can have a child with Fragile X syndrome. So people with a premutation can be parents to children with Fragile X syndrome. And that used to be thought to be the whole problem of being a premutation carrier. Worst case scenario, you would have a child with Fragile X syndrome. However, like I said, in the past 20 or so years, it's become evident that people who have the premutation have other related problems. Could I have the next slide? So these related problems, basically, we now understand Fragile X to be a group of related disorders, the most marked of which is Fragile X syndrome, the full mutation. Then there are a whole bunch of conditions that are related to being a premutation carrier. And unfortunately, they have these kind of annoying little acronyms, which one just has to deal with when one is interested in Fragile X syndrome. FAXTAS, FAXPOI, FAXAND, and FAXVAC. Very briefly, FAXTAS is the most commonly recognized of these consequences of carrying a premutation. That stands for the Fragile X-associated tremor ataxia syndrome. That's a movement disorder. Then we have FAXPOI, which is an ovarian insufficiency, which affects young women. I'll say more about that. FAXAND refers to psychiatric disorders that are overrepresented in premutation carriers. And FAXVAC refers to various non-psychiatric conditions, medical conditions that are overrepresented in carriers. Next slide. So what is going on with these conditions and these CGG repeats? If you look at the right-hand column in the slide, you see that a person with Fragile X syndrome has greater than 200 CGG repeats. And as a result, they are not making any FMR1 RNA. And as a result of that, they are not making any FMRP. So they are a person with no FMRP who therefore has full mutation Fragile X syndrome. If you look at the healthy person on the left-hand side of the slide, you see a person with fewer than 55 CGG repeats. And you can see that there are, below the sketch of the gene, there are 6 little squiggles. Those squiggles represent RNA, and that RNA is being used as a template to make this protein, FMRP. And there's a big bodacious amount of FMRP there to help the brain develop in a healthy way. In the carrier state, in the middle, we have 55 to 200 CGG repeats. And as you can see below that, the FMR1 mRNA, there is more of it. There's more than twice as much as there is in the normal person. And then that FMR1 mRNA is making a little bit less FMRP than we see in the normal person. They have enough FMRP there to stave off Fragile X syndrome. But what causes the problems associated with being a premutation carrier is not the FMRP, it's the RNA. They have between 2 to 10 times as much mRNA as a normal person, and that mRNA is what is causing the problems. RNA is sticky, it clumps up, it forms these little junky globs called inclusion bodies. It kills nerve cells, it damages ovaries and testes, and basically causes loads of problems within the body. And those problems affect carriers. They don't affect people who have Fragile X syndrome because those Fragile X syndrome people are not making that RNA. So it's the too much RNA that's causing the problems in carriers. Can I have the next slide? Just very quickly, FAXTAS is the most significantly recognized consequence of being a carrier. It consists of tremor ataxia, which refers to an uncoordinated gait, like the way a drunk person walks, and uncoordinated movements. They also have a memory deficit and significantly an executive function deficit. Executive function refers to things that you need to function as an executive, basically. What it means is with executive function, you're able to decide what you want to do, prioritize how you want to do it, figure out what the steps are, stick to the steps, check and make sure you're actually on task and complete the task. That's what you need to be an executive, and that's what you do with your executive function. People who have fax tasks lose some of that executive function, and that leads to lots of problems as they age and their executive function worsens. Next slide. Thanks. This represents FAX-POI. POI stands for primary ovarian insufficiency. And just briefly, this is something that affects girls and young women who are Fragile X carriers. About 20% of Fragile X carrier girls will have FAX-POI. They will have early menopause. As a result, they will have infertility and complications from their low estrogen state, like impaired bone health and cardiovascular problems and sexual dysfunction. Next slide. FAX-AND stands for neurodevelopmental disorders and neuropsychiatric disorders. These are overrepresented in carriers, ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, anxiety, depression, and other psychiatric disorders. And finally, next slide. FAX-VAC, which is a new acronym illustrating some medical problems that are overrepresented in carriers, including fibromyalgia, migraines, autoimmune problems, hypertension, thyroid disease, and others. And important to remember that some carriers have no symptoms whatsoever. Next slide. Okay, this is the most important slide that I want you to understand. This is a family tree or a genogram of a family that's affected by Fragile X syndrome. And this is not the family that I'm going to read about today, but it is the family, it is a family that I have written about in my book at great length. And the first thing I'd like you to notice is the filled in dark blue squares and circles. Those are people with full mutation Fragile X syndrome. Circles represent females and squares represent males. The people who have a circle or a square with a little dot in the middle are carriers, and the people who have people who just have empty squares and circles are people who are negative for problems with their Fragile X gene. What you should notice in this slide is that there's, on the lower left-hand corner, there is a dark blue circle with an arrow that's pointing to it. And that person is the index patient in this family. What that means is that is the first person in the family who came to medical attention and received an actual diagnosis of Fragile X syndrome. When this family found out that they had a person in the family with Fragile X syndrome, they did a lot of tests. This kind of testing is called cascade testing, where family members of an identified patient are tested. And what they discovered is in the fourth generation of this family, there are 4 kids with full mutation Fragile X syndrome, really about half the kids in that generation. And there's also 1 kid in the 5th generation who has Fragile X syndrome, excuse me. Before that, there are 3 generations on top of that 4th generation where nobody had Fragile X syndrome. But lots of people had lots of problems. And as you can see, with the knowledge that Fragile X was running in this family, we can now look back and see that many of these problems that existed in the previous 3 generations were related to having the Fragile X premutation, in other words, being a carrier. So the person at the very top, the great-great-great-grandmother, who is now dead, the slash means that the person has died, that person retrospectively, now that we can find out that she was a carrier of Fragile X syndrome, we now know that she had FAX-TAS, that she had fibromyalgia and neuropathy and was addicted to pain medications. Then we see a whole bunch of children of hers, and we see that 3 of her children were carriers, and that all of these carriers suffered from carrier-related issues: FAXTAS, FAXPOI, anxiety, depression, OCD, migraines, high blood pressure, hypothyroidism, chronic pain, ataxia, FAXPOI, etc. And then we go down another generation, still no kids with Fragile X syndrome. So this family still has no clue that there's something going on that may be genetic in their family. And we see a 29-year-old who dropped out of high school, addicted to alcohol and drugs. We see social anxiety, tremor, impotence, alcohol abuse, ADHD, learning disabilities. We see a young man who died of a gunshot wound, whom I write about at length in the book. And then finally, we get into that 4th generation with the index patient and the 4 out of 8 kids with Fragile X syndrome. And suddenly everyone in this family can look back and say, oh, maybe some of the stuff that was going on in our family that seemed like it was just random actually related to this diagnosis of Fragile X syndrome. So I'm done with my slides. Thank you. Now I'm going to just jump right in and read from the book. And what I'm going to read is basically a kind of a psychiatric case presentation. It's not, again, about the family that I just spoke of, but about a woman named Carol, who I evaluated both in person and over the phone on many occasions. And in this particular occasion, I refer to an evaluation that she was undergoing at a clinic called the Mind Institute in California, where they study Fragile X premutation-related disorders. Growing up in a Chicago suburb in the 1950s, Carol was inexplicably scorned by her father, who expressed his contempt for her and his wife in one blow: "You're stupid like your mother." Everyone else could see that Carol succeeded at everything she did. "I self-medicated by overachievement," she now says tartly. Carol has retired from more careers than most of us have ever started. She has been a community college professor known for her classes on feminism, a social worker with a thriving practice in the city of Chicago, and a self-taught expert in cesarean deliveries, whose rap sessions in the late 1970s helped doctors and patients understand that operative delivery could be as loving and inclusive as natural birth. Making a positive impact on countless lives helped boost her self-esteem, but it took an autopsy for her to forgive her father, his autopsy. "My dad could be a real son of a bitch," recalled Carol. "He could be very cruel to my mother. He always called us stupid. When Carol won a piano scholarship, he told her she wasn't talented enough to use it. Nevertheless, Carol stepped up. When she decided to become a social worker, she shunned the suburbs, preferring the challenge of advocating for newly released prisoners on the south side of Chicago in the 1970s. When she became a mother, she gave it everything she had, quitting a job she loved so she could devote herself to her baby, Amy. But after a few years as a stay-at-home mom, Carol was restless and bored and found a new cause. Her daughter had been born by cesarean section, which Carol, who always wanted to do everything exactly right, had found disappointing and dehumanizing. But rather than blame herself for failing at natural childbirth, Carol became an activist. She started a nonprofit organization to provide emotional support to families undergoing cesarean deliveries. It is routine today for fathers to be in the delivery room during cesareans, but in the 1970s, it required a campaign to change obstetricians' way of thinking about surgical deliveries. Then there was the postnatal experience. At the time, mothers did not hold and care for their babies in the aftermath of a cesarean. It was considered too dangerous. The birth council was part of that culture change, allowing babies to stay with their mothers after delivery. As part of her work with the birth council, Carol observed 400 cesarean births, standing on a platform so I could see right in. Carol's verve and ambition had an impact on her parenting too. Unfortunately, Amy, her eldest, did not thrive at school. Amy was introverted and a poor student. Math was impossible. Her true goal at school was never to be noticed. Contrasting Amy with her high-achieving, full-court press mother, counselors at school told Carol that Amy's problem was that she couldn't measure up to her mother's expectations. It's true that few children could live up to the standards Carol set for herself, and Amy confessed privately that she did feel that Carol favored her more academically successful brother, Jason. But when Amy's cousin, Ben, was diagnosed with Fragile X syndrome, testing of his family members, cascade testing, in which everyone related to the newly diagnosed child is tested, provided an explanation for Amy's difficulties. Amy had full mutation Fragile X syndrome. About a third of girls with the full mutation have normal or above normal IQs, and they get by in regular schools without drawing much notice. But most, like Amy, suffer from learning disabilities and significant social anxiety. Her brother Jason had escaped Fragile X completely, inheriting his mother's normal X chromosome. Amy's diagnosis of the full mutation made Carol an obligate premutation carrier as the mother of a child with Fragile X syndrome. When Carol's parents were tested to see which had passed the premutation to Carol, everyone in the family was sure it was Carol's mother. Louis, Carol's father, had called Carol's mother stupid so many times that even she believed it, but the carrier was Louis. Still, Louis's irrational meanness and misogyny was considered just an unfortunate part of Louis's personality until he developed tremor, ataxia, and other symptoms of Faxtas. Though some symptoms of Faxtas, for example, tremor and ataxia, are not usually evident until carriers are in their 50s or 60s, autopsies in younger men show that, in fact, men with Faxtas have detectable brain changes as early as their late 20s. Looking back, Carol now understands that her father's behavior was influenced by white matter changes and inclusion bodies throughout his brain, which are characteristic of some premutation carriers who eventually develop Faxtas. His executive function was severely impaired. His poor impulse control and inability to stay on task made him lash out at his wife and 2 daughters, unable to tolerate their spontaneity. Carol's gifts and vulnerabilities have made her aware of character traits since she was very young. She is fond of using Jung's terminology of psychological types, describing herself as introverted, intuitive, judging, and perceiving. Throughout her life, she has made a conscious effort to be unlike her, quote, Fragile X dad. She contrasts herself with her father's mother, who was never warm, quote, obviously premutated, says Carol. And indeed, Carol's grandmother was another obligate premutation carrier because her son was a carrier. Carol is proud that her grandchildren call her Silly Nana. But speaking with Carol, one can't help but wonder whether she might possibly share some of the traits she identifies as premutated. There is something controlled about the way she speaks of emotionally powerful topics. For example, she repeatedly describes watching 400 cesarean deliveries as an achievement, rather than as a privilege, a joy, or a fearsome experience. She uses jargon, describing her son as a genius IQ, but very right-brained. Of course, jargon can convey a lot of information succinctly, but it can also signify a lack of empathy, both for the son whom she describes so simplistically and for the listener who may not know what she is talking about. When Carol talks about her accomplishments, it seems possible that she has told the stories so many times that she rattles them off, rather than speaking from her lived experience. Her boundless energy floods the listener, but it may also have another unconscious purpose, to deflect attention from Carol's cognitive and emotional difficulties. In person, Carol is petite, with close-cropped copper hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a big cowl-necked sweater. She looks more like a Midwestern matron than a radical peacenik. At her evaluation, she repeated many stories she had told me years ago over the phone to many clinicians, word for word. She spoke of being right-brained and mentioned being at her father's autopsy half a dozen times. She brought up the 400 cesareans. She took pride in her accomplishments, which indeed were many, but anxiously, which would lead the listener to question whether she had true confidence in herself. One sentence she repeated several times was, "I was an introvert who learned to act like an extrovert." She corrected a doctor's pronunciation of the word perseveration, but apologized repeatedly for the occasional difficulties she had during motor testing. I thought that captured what I perceived as her unusual blend of perfectionism and insecurity. Other concerns she brought up at the evaluation included chronic worry about Amy and her own poor health. She reported chronic pain basically all over her body, a history of cancer, autoimmune hypothyroidism, and knee pain. She described herself as depressed. She had a history of obsessional checking. She had restless leg syndrome, frequent vertigo and falls, migraines, and pain in all her joints. Carol has many issues related to the premutation, but something Carol said about her infancy was thought-provoking. She was a full-term baby, but weighed only 3 pounds at birth because she and her mother had Rh incompatibility. She required special care, and, Carol emphasized, my mother wasn't allowed to hold me for 2 weeks. No wonder she wanted to hold her baby after her cesarean delivery, to the extent that it became a passion that absorbed several years of her life. How much of Carol's character related to Faxan? And how much to such severe early infantile deprivation, perhaps followed by years of verbal abuse by her premutation carrier father? What happens when you take a daughter with a genetic predisposition to anxiety and mood disorders and pair her with a father who is dismissive, insulting, and just generally verbally abusive, who himself had a genetic predisposition to anxiety and mood disorders, who himself was brought up by a mother who was obviously premutated, to use Carol's words, who didn't give his daughter the good enough parenting that helps children grow up confident and able to tolerate life's ups and downs? Perhaps what we see is someone like Carol, a woman who has devoted her entire life to pleasing and sacrificing for others, but whose self-esteem hangs by an IQ point. This is an important fact about premutation carriers. They are raised by premutation carriers. There are several different ways that Carol's genetic predisposition to anxiety and depression, her nature, if you will, was influenced by events external to her own genome. Her father, as Carol described him, was an abusive parent who eventually developed Faxtas. Her father's abuse was also addressed to her mother, which presumably had an impact on her parenting too. These realities might be referred to as nurture. In addition, by chance, Carol was deprived of maternal contact in a very early formative period, her first 2 weeks of life, which may have had an impact on her health today, more than 70 years later. Call that deprivation of nurturance environmental. Though people continue to debate whether nature or nurture and heredity or environment are more influential for any given human trait, most geneticists today accept the truism that nature and nurture are so fundamentally intertwined that it does not really make sense to ask the question. Carol's newborn period is an excellent example of why. Because Carol's inherited blood type differed from her mother's, the treatment that was available at the time and place that she was born required them to be separated for 2 weeks. Carol was deprived of contact with her mother, and her mother was deprived of contact with Carol. Carol's genetic endowment, her blood type in this case, had a huge influence on her social environment, nurturance from her mother. And the social environment that resulted had a huge influence on Carol. Then, after Amy's cesarean birth, when I hypothesize Carol was motivated to form the Cesarean Birth Council, at least in part due to her wish to repair the early life experience she had giving birth to Amy, that she had being separated from her mother at birth, she went on to influence the early life experience of innumerable other infants she would never meet. I'm going to stop there.
Sorry. Thank you, Anne, for that wonderful excerpt from your book. I want to point out that one of the things that Anne talks about in her book is that all of those pesky acronyms for those associated syndromes with carriers, Faxtas, Faxan, Faxpoi, these were discovered not through a laboratory, but by talking to the children of affected of carriers who had these sorts of problems, mothers who came in with Fragile X children, who then talked about their own problems or the problems of their parents, who were often deteriorating just as they were dealing with a Fragile X child. And one of the things that Anne says that I just want to put in here before we go on to our discussants, that and these are Anne's words, FACS-TAS was discovered through, not through technical breakthroughs, but through empathy. When doctors listen closely to their patients with enough care, they are not just being kind, they are part of a process of discovery. And so you have some extremely important and impactful disorders out there that have not been characterized. When I was in medical school, Fragile X carriers were considered completely unaffected. And now we know so much more. After reading Anne's book, I realized that one of my own patients probably had FACS-TAS and passed away from it after having a very bewildering course of degeneration, of deterioration that nobody understood whatsoever, and has children that are carriers that themselves have inexplicable behavior. So thank you, Anne, for that. And now let's go on to Professor Stern.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you for including me in this conversation. I'm joining this conversation in my capacity as a historian of genetics and eugenics, and as someone who's written on the history of genetic counseling, as Professor Tutter mentioned earlier. And what I'd like to do with my time is to situate Fragile X in this longer historical arc, which I think raises interesting questions about the timing of scientific discovery, the naming of particular conditions, the interpretation of risk, and also the important role of genetic counseling and genetic counselors. So let's first of all think about the timing. So if we go back to the description, looking at the nomenclature by Bell and Martin, that was in 1943. So what was going on in terms of genetics in 1943? This was, still very much, during not quite the heyday, but still quite distinct popularity for the eugenics movement in the United States, which, as many of you are aware, emerged in the early 20th century and really mobilized, primitive concepts of genetics to label people as normal or abnormal, fit or unfit. What's interesting is that I don't find, in looking at the history, it doesn't seem like Bell and Martin, their work really spilled over into eugenics, but it doesn't mean that they weren't kind of in cross dialogue, at least in terms of the language being used and the expectations about normality that were kind of popular at the time. So in 1943, the labeling that they did would have been using terms such as feeble-minded or later mental retardation. So that's 1943. Next kind of point on the chronology is thinking about Herbert Loves, who observed the fragile site on the X chromosome in 1969. And I learned a lot of this through, most of this through Anne's wonderful book, which provides the historical backdrop for making sense of really where we are in the current moment in understanding Fragile X, and it's the spectrum of conditions that we've just been discussing. And then if we jump forward, and so stopping again in 1969, what was going on in 1969? This is, by this time, there's chromosome analysis, there's karyotyping, amniocentesis is just getting up and running, and in fact will become much more popularized by the 1970s. So we're moving into the kind of era of genetic cytology, as well as, what will become much more common in terms of prenatal diagnosis, first with amniocentesis, then with CVS, and then obviously now with a range of other kind of free DNA technologies and things like that. And then if we jump ahead 20 more years, when the FRM1 gene was identified and sequenced, that was in 1989. So by 1989, we're in the kind of era of the Human Genome Project and the sequencing and decoding of the entire human genome. When there's great excitement and promise and hype about all of the knowledge that this might generate and how this will allow for treatments and cures and so on. We can say again and again that with the history of genetics, from whatever direction you look at it from, whether it's kind of really problematic eugenicists in the early 20th century, or whether it's, geneticists who want to make significant strides in treating genetic disorders, that, often with genetics, the hype definitely is much bigger than the actual applicability of what is learned. And so I think Fragile X and its conditions really point us in many ways to the sticky, hard issues around uncertainty in diagnosis. So 1989, and then since then, thanks to the clinicians and scientists discussed in the book, we've learned a lot more about the role of sequence repeats, of AGG interruptions, and that the repeat number increases, move down from generation to generation, also in relation to gender in terms of X, Y, and so on. So we're now at a place where there's much more deeper understanding and much more nuanced understanding of this, let's say, umbrella of generational conditions that fits under Fragile X. So it is interesting to trace it over time and to see where we arrive today. And I'd want to go back to a point that Adele made, which is, that it's really important to recognize the extent to which scientific understanding and approaches to Fragile X have been shaped by observation, empathy, and understanding families and families across generations. And that's more than just producing a pedigree chart. That's actually getting to know the families and getting to know how patterns unfolded after time. So as Adele mentioned, I have founded and co-run the Sterilization and Social Justice Lab, and we look at the history of eugenic sterilization in the United States over the 20th century, looking at 5 states. And our biggest state is the state of California, where more than 20,000 people were sterilized. So actually, we went and we have a data set, and we've extracted all the data from the historical materials, and we're able to do a lot of targeted analysis and searching with the data set. So I asked my team to go in and see if they could find any either Martin or Bell, particularly in the years of the 40s and 50s, to see if there was any labeling that was connected to kind of the first, the first term that was used for Fragile X, and we didn't find any. But it is possible that, there were individuals. I think it's really likely that there were a subset of people who ended up in institutions like the Sonoma State Home and potentially other psychiatric. That was a feeble-minded home, but they ended up also in the psychiatric homes, who had any of the number of the Fragile X and, kind of the different conditions that have been discussed. We'll never really know, because what we have in the records are these catch-all categories, such as feeble-mindedness or mental retardation, often attached to IQ. And I would say the IQ scores are not necessarily reliable, because they were so culturally biased, and it was so problematic the way in which the testing was often done in a very inhospitable environment, that I take those with many grains of salt. What's interesting, though, is that, in this same period that we were talking about in the 1960s, when we see the rise of karyotyping, and, that was when the photographs were taken, and, the technicians would need to cut them out and put them on a piece of paper so they could look at kind of the 22 autosomes and then the sex chromosomes. And that's where Lubb saw that fragile site on the X. In any case, some cytologists were using places like Sonoma State Home as a laboratory for this earlier karyotyping, because they had a very vulnerable population. So we did find diagnoses that would be associated, more specifically like ataxia and certain types of ataxia. So that's a really interesting question for me historically. How were people with Fragile X conditions swept up into institutionalization in the 20th century in similar ways that people with Huntington's disease might have been? Because we do have some actual cases where people were misdiagnosed with certain conditions and then later found to have Huntington's. For me, it's really painful to think of all the individuals who were not recognized as affected by Fragile X and were just basically put in this kind of like dustbin, let's say, of feeble-mindedness, of mental retardation. And I think that the entanglement of this condition with institutionalization has not been fully recognized and is something that historians of medicine who care about, genetics and issues of disability could really look at. So by the time Lubbs had made his observation, sterilizations that occurred based on diagnoses of mental retardation, feeble-mindedness, ataxia, other conditions were ending. They never completely declined, but those institutions began to close. And then we move ahead, as I was discussing before, in further research in clinical awareness in the 20th century, which happens in tandem with the sequencing of the human genome. And now, then really the expansion, we could say the explosion of new types of genetic tests. So, prenatal tests as well as newborn panels and so on. So another aspect of, kind of mapping this historically is to think about the role of genetic counseling. So by the time Fragile X was better understood, genetic counseling had become a full-fledged profession. So if we look back at the early history of genetic counseling, it was very much entangled with the eugenics movement. In fact, we could say it was kind of born out of the eugenics movement in ways that the field continues to reckon with and recognize and deal with as wanting to kind of transform itself and shed that baggage. So, we could look back at the field workers, the case histories, the pedigree charts, the kind of labels of feeble-mindedness that I was just discussing, and really the moralistic judgments that were made. And I think that's an interesting question to talk about, even as Fragile X conditions have become better understood scientifically. It seems like the moral judgments still remain and follow these families around in ways that are really harmful for them. The term genetic counseling was coined in 1947 by Sheldon Reed at the Diet Institute at the University of Minnesota. And he was very interested in mental retardation, although it doesn't appear he was aware of Martin-Bell syndrome at the time. That doesn't enter into his work, although he picked up where eugenicists left off in the 1920s in Minnesota, he and his wife. And by the way, there are many patterns here of these bigwig geneticists whose wives are doing a lot of the work and compiling a lot of the information, and they're always first author or kind of the only author on these books. But anyway, that was Sheldon Reed and his wife. They published this massive study of mental retardation at the Faribault State Home, concluding that it was largely driven by heredity, although they conceded that environmental factors could play a significant role. So the genetic counselors of the era from the 40s to the 60s were really kind of male scientists and geneticists like Sheldon Reed, who sometimes gave although they liked the term and started fooling around with the term non-directiveness, they ended up giving advice which we would view today as overly directive. Things began to shift in the late 1960s with a new generation of genetic counselors, almost all women, who I think are really important in understanding the strides that have been made around understanding Fragile X conditions. These were women who combined scientific knowledge with empathetic understanding of families. And they wanted to combine, and I think there's a very nice section in Anne's book where she says this genetic counselor focused less on the genetics, which obviously she knew, and more on the counseling. And the counseling part of it and meeting people where they are and learning how to have difficult conversations with patients and their family, because genetic counseling is almost always a family affair. And that's something that genetic counselors know and navigate every day. I could talk at greater length about the rise of genetic counseling programs. I think the main thing to note is that, they started in the late 1960s. The first one was at Sarah Lawrence College, founded in 1969, and then went on to be founded at Rutgers and UC Berkeley. And now I think there's almost maybe over more than 40 master's degree level genetic counseling programs in the United States. That train genetic counselors in a whole array of different areas. Initially, it was more prenatal with a focus on amniocentesis. Over time, adult onset became important, as well as cancer genetics and also cardiovascular conditions and so on and so forth. What I find really, striking about the family of Fragile X conditions and the variation is that all of them touch on dimensions of genetic counseling. So the prenatal, and all of them make an appearance in Anne's book: prenatal, newborn, adult onset, and probability testing. And that leads to one of my penultimate point, which is really thinking about risk. So there's a long history of thinking about medical risk, like where did risk even come from? In fact, the term goes back to pre-modern years, when it was used by sailors to talk about kind of risks of maritime risks and risk of storms and risk of kind of dangers in navigation. So it's interesting to think that as it became imported into medicine and to other aspects of kind of rational decision making, how it kind of became more reductive in that way. Genetics is discussions of medical genetics are often about risk management. And, in my book, the Telling Genes, one of the chapters I focus on risk. And one of the things that's really striking is that if you look at, pedigree charts and the way in which geneticists were using them until about the 1960s, I mean, that's what they had to go on. It was classical Mendelian genetics for the most part. It's dominant or it's recessive. And that's going to give these discrete chunks. It's going to be 50% or it's going to be 25% or 0 or 100%. But then as, genetics became more complex and there was a better understanding of the polygenetic nature of many diseases, then probabilities like Bayesian statistics, all of this started to make more of an appearance. And so in a way, Fragile X kind of maps on more to the probabilistic side, but it troubles that, because risk assessment, from what I've learned from Anne's book with Fragile X, is incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Because not only, yes, you might be able to have some predictive value about how many repeats, would appear in the second, third, fourth, or fifth generation, but you don't know how those are actually going to be expressed phenotypically, especially in the gray zone that Anne talks about so eloquently in her book. This then goes back to the discussion of genetic counselors. This makes, working with Fragile X families really challenging, and I would suspect rewarding for genetic counselors, because they are at that point, and physicians as well, but really focusing on genetic counselors who often have more time to meet with patients and their family. How do you communicate that uncertainty? How do you communicate the unknown and the fact that even with all these predictive tools, families are often in unpredictable situations in terms of the manifestation, the timing, the severity, and so on and so forth. And another point related to that is all these questions about risk. How much risk is tolerable? And we're a very risk-averse society. I'm a dean in a university. I can tell you how risk-averse institutions are. Risk is, people don't like to tolerate much risk. And one of the things I found in looking at kind of the history of risk across genetics is that initially, especially in the Sheldon Reed era, people might have been okay with even a 25% risk. That didn't seem that low. But now even the fact that someone might be at risk for something makes them nervous, even if it's a 3% risk or a 2% risk. So I think that, this makes Fragile X conditions even more fraught because of the concerns about risk and the facts that risk itself might indicate there's even a remote possibility, which for some people might be translate into a high possibility. And then, of course, risk and how it's understood varies from person to person based on their background, their life circumstances, their faith circumstances, and so on and so forth. So I would love to talk more about, how do you think about risk in a way that is supportive and productive and not just scary in the context of Fragile X? And the point I'd like to close with is that, in terms of, thinking about how difficult Fragile X and its conditions have been for so many families, it would be interesting for me to think about the role of applying, potentially applying more of a disability studies frame to Fragile X. So that means getting out of kind of the medical model where it's about, pathologizing and, really more about thinking about the, holistically about individuals, where the problem, from disability studies perspective is not the person with the disability, it's the society that pathologizes the person with disability. I do think, though, that we need to recognize at the same time that there is severity, impairment, and serious issues, life-threatening issues, quality of life issues that come with Fragile X conditions. So I myself am actually struggling to really think about how to use a disability studies frame to think about Fragile X in a way that is humanistic and, again, supportive, while recognizing that this condition has taken a toll on many people over many generations. So with that, I'll close my comments, and thank you again for including me in the conversation.
Well, thank you, Professor Stern, Dean Stern, for any broad and deep discussion of so many related concerns. You use the word dustbin, which is just really struck a chord with me, because one of the problems with using a disability model is that to have a disability, it has to be defined. And I remember being an intern and doing a year of internal medicine in Philadelphia at HUP, at the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, and I had a clinic, which was crazy. And people would come in and they would say, I have back pain, I have shortness of breath, my fingers hurt, I itch, I go to the bathroom all the time. They would have a million problems, and I would open their chart and I wouldn't know these people. They would just come to the clinic and they had about 16 different diagnoses: asthma, hypertension, high cholesterol, cardiac disease. And I would go to my attending and I would say, well, what do I do? And he would say, nobody can have that many problems. Just focus on the top two. And I remember thinking that's awful, because these are not independent problems. These are all, they're all interrelated. Now, one of the problems I think with I just keep on wondering how many people out there with what we consider garden variety anxiety or personality disorders, how many of them are carriers? And we just don't know. Typically, women are not listened to very carefully. We were talking about listening earlier. And typically, people with a lot of symptomatology that doesn't seem to hew into the classic DSM diagnoses, they tend to be discounted. They have a little bit of this, they have a little bit of that. And of course, if nothing makes sense, then we say that they're personality disordered. I would imagine that there are a lot of women in that dustbin that have some sort of, and the things that give people a bad name, like fibromyalgia, they say, people say, is that even real? It's like one of those cuckoo things. And I think that this whole book for me has really sort of opened up a way of thinking about all those patients that end up in a dustbin because they don't fit and because and people don't listen to them. Anyway, that's my soapbox, which I will get off now so that Dan can have a chance to speak. You're on, Dan.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to show some slides. So let's see if I can. Yeah, so Adele, what you were saying is really right on with what I've been thinking. Like how much do we know about our patients? And I'm speaking from the point of view of a clinician, a child, adolescent, adult psychiatrist, and psychoanalyst who also does some developmental neuroscience. And I have to say that Anne's book really gets at an interest of mine, the heart of my research, which is intergenerational trauma. This is intergenerational. It's genetic, it's epigenetic, and it's traumatic in terms of the behavioral effects in parents to their children, and how these experiences end up being understood and not being understood, and then being re-understood. If we go to the case that Anne focused on, Carol, which is in chapter 5, we hear, that this is somebody who's really accomplished and is, as Anne said, is trying to cover up certain difficulties that she has. She talks about understanding perseveration when she's in fact perseverative, and I think it's so important that she is trying to overcome in her overachieving the history of trauma from her father, Louis, who turns out to have this premutation disorder. And what this case brings to the fore, just of Carol, we're going to get to her daughter Amy as well, is that there's a really dynamic, complex system that's behind multiple behavioral phenomena, both in Louis and in Carol, and then in the next generation, Amy. And when we traditionally think, from going back to the 70s and 80s, of the biopsychosocial model, but in fact, that model, which is still quite pertinent, becomes more profound as we think of the biological, which is both the body, but then it goes deeper to the cellular, the genetics, the constitution of the organism, that is in some ways an external reality, as I'll get to in psychoanalytic terms. There's the psychological, what does the mind make of the biological, and what is environmental or social, which is external to the individual. It involves relationships with other individuals, such as the caregivers, and as well as with the non-social world in terms of the environment, climate change, catastrophes, earthquakes, wars, or beautiful sunsets, or positive environmental factors. So it's really a biological, environmental, psychological model that Anne is getting at. And in this case of Carol, the premutation associated disorder, the FX-AND, is a hidden player in Louis's genetics, his biology, that impacts his behavior towards Carol. But she experiences subjectively her father's insensitive caregiving, which occurs during sensitive periods of her development, sensitive and critical periods of social emotional development in early life, which also affects, in turn, epigenetics. And because, as Anne said, there's this constant gene-environment interaction going on, but it's not just the DNA, it's also the expression of the genes in terms of the shape of the molecule, the external structure of the molecule, which lets it be open to RNA or not, for the expression of proteins. And Carol also is internalizing social environmental experiences with her father, her difficulties with executive functioning that she overcompensates for, or compensates for in different ways. and these become memories that are filtered through her psychic apparatus. She comes to believe, as many young children do, that she must be the bad or defective one, that her father calls her mother stupid, she's not talented, even though she wins the piano scholarship. And she goes on to have an enduring struggle with her self-esteem, the regulation of her self-esteem, which some people, term narcissism or difficulty with narcissistic traits. She develops a form of, you could say, of post-traumatic stress, the form of hypervigilance, an aversion, avoidance of the aggression that she knew from her father. And this is a formative experience in her life that gets transmitted to her parenting of her children. And this is so without any notion of Fragile X or premutation disorders, very similar to what we find in our research on mothers who've suffered from childhood maltreatment, domestic violence or family violence exposure, who develop post-traumatic stress disorder and other comorbid trauma-related psychopathology, including depression, dissociative problems, anxiety problems, somatoform problems. And as Adele said, if you don't know what it is, it's personality disorder. And it brings up the question of how many of the mothers that we see in our research, or patients that we see, men and women who go on to become parents, have some additional biological substrate which we don't know about yet, whether it's related to Fragile X or anything else. And this is true for all of us. We don't know. It's a reality, but it's also a mythology. We try to make sense of our experience, and we use whatever information we either get or intuit or infer. And so if we think of how does this affect Carol's parenting with Amy, how does this affect Amy? Amy is triply affected because she has actually the full mutation. She has the full shebang of Fragile X, but also has a mother whose psychological functioning is affected by the abuse linked to her maternal grandfather's premutation disorder, and all that Carol has constructed to make sense of that and to avoid reproducing what her father did with her, although of course it's impossible to completely avoid the inheritance of psychological influences from our parents. So Amy then witnesses her maternal grandfather and her own mother develop the ecstase with tremor, ataxia, and other brain changes that affect their personality, cognitive functioning, and neurological status. And Anne writes that Carol has made a conscious effort in her life not to be like her father, but then the really tragic aspect of this is that despite all her efforts, she sees herself developing the syndrome that he had. And her daughter sees this too. And so Anne goes on to point out that many painful conditions are linked to adverse childhood events, and both in the lives of Carol and we heard also Lewis is probably also raised by premutations. This is really a multi-generational process. And Carol and Amy both have these adverse childhood events with and the investigators, according to what Anne writes, is the work of Anne and Filiti, the effects of ACEs are mediated by the anxiety and depression, other psychopathology that follows from them, and also has to do, as we understand now, with inflammatory processes, and yet further biological substrate, cellular changes, tissue changes, hormonal changes that lead to all of these issues that Adele referred to in that clinic in Pennsylvania. So there's also the separation from all the other things that Anne mentioned, separation from mother, verbal abuse by father, witnessing the father's abuse. And one thing that is very important as well is people have very similar adverse childhood events. They may even have similar premutation disorders and genetics and epigenetic changes, but they have very different outcomes. And so one of the things we tried to ask in our research, and there are many other groups that do that as well, what happens that leads a child who's someone like Carol, who's in an environment of trauma, and Amy, who's the child of the child who's experienced that trauma from Lewis, what leads them to be more the perpetrators of, for example, the abuse, the violence, versus anxious versus resilient versus a combination? How do early positive attachment relationships impact early deprivation, such as being removed in the first couple weeks from mother, in Carol's case? And what we did in our study was to look at mothers who had come in with domestic violence exposure specifically, and we found that most of these women had histories of physical abuse, sexual abuse, and domestic violence exposure, so that intergenerational aspect in their lives. And these women go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder, and we compare them to women mothers who may have had violent experiences, but not to the same degree, and who don't develop post-traumatic stress disorder. And so what we found is that just with that, without knowing if they had any other biological substrates, these mothers go on to have difficulty identifying emotions in self and others. So there's that difficulty with empathy, difficulty mentalizing or taking the place of their child, their perspective, and less sensitivity to child's distress during interactive behavior, dysregulated circadian rhythms with respect to stress physiology, in particular cortisol, a glucocorticoid, and the epigenetics just of that, as Anne actually also goes into in the book, which is again another layer of genetics, epigenetics, that there's decreased methylation in individuals who have chronic early stress, such as maltreatment or exposure to domestic violence, as Carol has, verbal abuse of the mother at least. Decreased methylation of the glucocorticoid receptor gene, which is called NR3C1. And similarly, this decreased methylation is associated with decreased neural activity in top-down medial prefrontal regulatory areas of the brain in response to scenes that evoke violence between adult men and women, but also in scenes that show their own and unfamiliar toddlers during separation. We know that little kids ages 1 to 3 don't like to be separated. They can't imagine that the parent hasn't fallen off the face of the earth, and they get extremely anxious, terrified, and they become dysregulated. And that dysregulation can trigger, based on our observations in the research, trigger post-traumatic stress symptoms in the mother with avoidance, fight, flight. They can fight, so the mothers can also become aggressive and be afraid of being aggressive, and can freeze, can become dissociated. And so when we follow these children, so whether it's Carol or Amy, for example, we see that just the experiences lead to multiple problems. The fact that the mother, for example, Carol, who has probably some aspects of PTSD, she may have had some depression, she's been exposed to violence, dissociative, I don't know. But in any case, these factors end up predicting over 8 years, in this case, PTSD symptoms in the child, despite the best efforts of the parent to contain and to not repeat what they've been through. Their behavior, as we see in Carol, it can be transmitted. Their experiences can pass on, and the kids develop more anxiety. They can develop more aggression, ADHD symptoms, bullying, and images or mental representations of parents that are harsh. So the children have all kinds of similar difficulties in reactivity to stress. And what we found is that the endophenotype that most likely to lead to aggression is if you have males with lower salivary cortisol reactivity to social stress, they're more likely to be aggressive. And this during early childhood, during sensitive periods of development, early childhood, more likely to be aggressive by middle childhood. And we see concomitant patterns of decreased NR3C1 methylation, et cetera. This is all relevant to Carol. And the other issue is the intrapsychic. What do you make of this trauma that you've been through, and how does it affect your ability to relate to your infant if you're a parent, and how, despite your best efforts to not repeat what you've been through with your child, or have your child repeat what you've been through, the parent communicates their experience, and so you have a sort of skewing of intersubjectivity towards trauma. And we've shown this as a mom who takes out an alligator puppet and it seems to be just playing with the kid, but the kid is genuinely scared, and she's not aware of the fact that she's actually scaring her kid. And so, to come back to how does somebody like Carol and Anne, who's trying to make sense of this with her, and Amy, who's going to make sense of her mom and grandparents. Hegel, challenged us by saying that the relationship of the psyche to reality, or to the real, is the subject to the object, is a conundrum for the philosopher. Freud, when he talked about psychic or internal reality, psychic reality is what opposes the pleasure principle. So everything that's in conflict with pleasure is the real. The real is what the body seeks. For Lacan, the real, or réel in German, became an anagram for leer, or void. It's unknowable, it's irreducible. How do Carol, her father, and her daughter process the unknowable, the irreducible reality of the premutation disorder that's affecting their relationships? And we know that reality is, from Fonagy and Target's work, psychoanalysts, the distinction between what's real externally and internally is formed in the early parent-child relationship. And this is in the history of British object relations writers, theorists. And one way of that the presentation of the premutation syndrome adds a way of being with, it changes the early internal representations formed by Carol of her father. And we don't know exactly, Anne tells us a bit how. And I think the main question that I have, to make it short, is how do Carol and Amy change with the learning about their premutation syndrome disorder? The understanding that Carol's father had this condition, does it help? How does it hinder? How does it fit into their respective and individual internal realities? And so that's really how does it help? Does it help this, for her to know this? And if so, how? Was it, not his fault because he had this? Probably not. Maybe Anne can respond to that. The demute.
Shall I respond to that,
Thank
Dan?
you. Thank you, Dan. Yes, go ahead, Anne.
I think in the case of Carol, Amy, and the father Lewis, I think it was extremely helpful for them to be presented with this diagnosis. Especially, I think for Amy, who as a young teenager was struggling greatly at school and had extremely low self-esteem in the setting of being desperately shy, terribly anxious, throwing up before parties, unable to pass her math classes, and being increasingly disfavored by her mother, for whom academic success was really everything. It was such a relief for Amy to finally have an explanation for her difficulties, and became meaningful subsequently for Carol, who could ease up a little bit on Amy and who could begin to forgive her father in this kind of crazy way, which didn't come out in the reading, but the Carol insisted on being present at her father's autopsy, and specifically on seeing his brain being lifted out of his skull, which, as you can imagine, both provided some kind of closure for her, but also was really quite a hostile act. She wanted to see her father's skull cut open and his brain removed. These things were healing for her, and kind of give you an indication of how abused she really felt, that she needed this kind of closure. So I think it was very meaningful for that all three generations of that family to learn about this diagnosis.
I can only help but wonder about Lewis's experience of himself. Did he have some awareness that he was losing executive function by the time he had Carol? Was he projecting his own experience of feeling not too smart onto his children and wife, who were probably at some point had surpassed him cognitively as he declined?
I assume that. I never met him. He had died before I got involved with his family, but that's my assumption.
And then for Carol, I mean, it must have been so difficult. It must have been impossible for her to avoid identifying with her father when she felt critical of her child's lack of success in school. Mm-hmm. For her to be critical of her child was to be like dad, which would have been awful for her. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to thank you, Dan, for your presentation. Your data is really compelling, and it's such important work that you're doing.
Thanks.
Really
I just see the synergy with Anne's. The book is fabulous in that it if we didn't know anything about the Fragile X history, we would say this is a rich psychiatric case, and yet it has a whole other dimension. And how many other patients that we would see, or how many other individuals we cross paths with every day, have this other dimension or multiple dimensions we're not aware of. And it's just fascinating. It really opens up a whole universe. Yeah.
I just want to say something. I left this slide out because of time, but the CDC estimates that there are approximately 1 million pre-mutation carriers living in the US. And because if you think back on my slide with the family tree, the genogram, there's such a small number of people with full mutation Fragile X syndrome and such a relatively large number of people who are affected by the pre-mutation. Even though Fragile X is a very, very rare condition, the pre-mutation is much more common than
Fascinating.
And it's just one gene. Yeah. There's so many other genes.
The gene that does it all.
Yeah.
I want to thank Anne, Dan, and Alex for a really quite an amazing evening. Anne's book is, I'm going to put a shameless plug in for Anne's book, The Carriers. It's a wonderful book. It's beautifully written. Really proud of Anne, and it's a great accomplishment. And I'm really proud of the work that Dan and Alex are doing. Such important work. It's very inspiring. So thank you all. Thank all of our attendees for joining us this evening. And this video will be posted onto our YouTube channel within a few days. And just let me know if you need the link. So with that, I will say good night and thank you again.
Thanks so much, everyone.